Hi everyone, welcome to THD, and today we are going to talk about budget deck. So, what is a budget deck? A deck that pretty much tries to take into account not only the power level of deck and how competitive it is in a competitive environment, but also take into account the price, the monetary price of the deck. Obviously, a deck that is mindful to how expensive it is to acquire if someone was wanted to go on card market or on TCG Player and try to buy this deck on the website. And it turns out that I think in the current meta, there's quite a few decks that are, in my opinion, very powerful and very affordable. One of the big strengths of Shadow of the Galaxy is that most of the strong cards in Shadow of the Galaxy are uncommons or rares, and legendaries are overall relatively weak. Which means that it is, in my opinion, relatively easy to. It has never been easier to build a deck that is very powerful for a reasonable price. So obviously, what everybody has a different definition of what they consider to be a budget deck. So me, I went for a deck that is less than 50 euros to acquire, and that doesn't have any legendaries in it. That's kind of how I settled on this. So I have four lists to show you. There's basically two main ways to build a budget deck. The first way is to take a deck that is not a budget deck and then downgrade it or replace some of the cards in order to make it budget. Or the second method is to take a deck that is already very budget, that by itself does not need any legendary or rare to function. So today I'm going to show you four decks that I believe are very powerful and are relatively cheap to acquire, that should be able to acquire for less than $50. So who do I advise people to play budget deck? Obviously, anybody who's not yet completely convinced whether they want to jump in the game or not, if they want to try their feet in a competitive environment with a competitive deck, but are not willing to make the initial investments and don't have any friends to let them cards. A budget deck could be a good option. It can be also a good option for people who maybe already play a normal deck, but would like to expand their horizon and play different decks, but don't necessarily have the budget to buy a new one. Or also it could be something like, let's say you want to have a friend join in an event, and then you are basically giving them a deck to join along, and you might not have enough cards to build two very competitive decks, so you just give them this budget version. So so this is my first. I decided to go for the most obvious one. It is the budget Tarkin vehicle deck. So obviously a deck that has been around for the very beginning of Shadow of the Galaxy. I think the initial creator is called Beton, also known as Voltor, and he's a very very good deck builder. And he built this aggressive deck. I made an entire video about it if you want to know more in details. So this is pretty much, like, in my opinion, one of the best budget deck because it has very powerful synergies between the cards. You can really take people by surprise. I think there's a lot of people who are. This deck is currently not making like massive results in tournament, but I strongly believe that it is due to the pilots. I think there's simply something you gotta understand in Star Wars Limited. It is a game of skill more than anything. So, and I believe that most people who are running this deck are indeed people who are not necessarily super experienced with the game, and basically don't and by definitions are not going to produce as good result as a very very experienced player would. This is, in my opinion, the reason why this is the main reason why this deck is not really producing a lot of results. But I'm pretty sure that if this was played by very good players to the same extent that other tier decks, I believe this would be a perfectly. It would make some strong result because the deck is undeniably, in my opinion, very powerful. I actually believe that obviously it was a little bit better at the beginning of the meta where it was really taking people by surprise. But it still I think is a very valid deck, and it has loads of very powerful synergies. It's also very fun to play because there's a lot of cool, fun combos to play in there. So it's a deck that I think, as a budget option, is has always been very, very viable. So as you can see, I think the only main differences on my version compared to my previous version was that I don't play Change of Heart because I avoid running any legendaries. I run Prepare to Take Off instead as a way to deal in grindy matchups in order to basically this card is basically a draw 2 for 2. It's even better than that because you get to dig up to 7 cards down in your deck. So it's a fairly, so I think the deck is very powerful. It has loads of powerful synergies. If you want more details about it, I made a video about it. So moving on to the second budget deck. It's a deck that is a lot more recent. I mean, a deck that recently has made quite a bit of splash. So he's done a result. It done pretty well in Take the Initiative, Top Cut tournament. You also have a top 8 in Barcelona with the Cad Bane red. So I've never talked. So I've talked about this deck in my tournament reports. So basically, what's the idea of the deck? It is basically an aggro deck that is going to be taking advantage of Cad Bane's ability and playing a lot of small underworld units, and in combination with Tarkin Town in order to take control of the board in the early stages of the game. And then once you take control of the board, it's basically gonna put a lot of threats and just basically overwhelm you with threats and just win the game from there. So it's an aggro deck, but an aggro deck that is aiming in the early stage of the game to control the board, not simply just deal damage heads down. So it has obviously all those cheap underworld like Greedo, the antagonizer, the reckless gunslingers, preferably units that have entering battlefield effect like Cartel Spacer, Bazine, and then he has Lady Proxima to deal a bit of damage along the way by doing so, and then he plays McClunky, replay those cards, get rid of enemy units, trigger Cad Bane. You get the idea. Obviously, a combination between Cad Bane and Tarkin Town is very powerful, as you get to deal damage to something and use Tarkin Town to finish that unit off. And then from that point on, it basically keeps control of the game with ambush unit like 4 LOM, Bosk. It has a little bit of card draw with Jabba the Hutt, which there's 9 tricks in the deck, 3 Whaley, 3 Shoot First, 3 McClunky. So Jabba the Hutt's relatively consistent, provide you with a big body that you can use Surprise Strike on, you can use Ultra DL44 blasters. Jabba is not really a great body by himself at 2-8, but once he gets this the 44 blasters, then he becomes a 4-8 and becomes a lot bigger of a threat. We also have some really cool synergy with Toro Calican, so 3/5 that gets to ready every time you play a bounty unit. So you play Toro Calican, and then you have loads of little bounty hunters to untap him, and like Bosk, 4 LOMs, Greedo, and then you get to attack over and over again. We also have some pirated Starfighter things, so we play small unit to play Starfighter, bounce it back into your hand, and we can replay him and retrigger his effect. Like for example, for Reckless Gunslinger, we have loads of small gold units, so the curse of the deck is very low, but because we have so many, we have card draw with Jabba the Hutt, and we have so many small gold cards with Reckless Gunslinger, DF44 Blasters, and Bazine, we don't really usually run out of cards. So this version of the deck has been I basically to run this version I took the base of 2 moons, and basically instead of I've made a few changes to the deck. Instead of Lucky, I play Bosk for the Bosk Matt McClunky or Bosk Shoot First synergy, and also because Bosk is a bounty hunter synergized with Toro, and I replaced the 3 Boba Fett's Disintegrator by 3 Toro. I think Toro is in this deck. I don't think it's worth. And I actually think that there might be a chance where that Toro is actually better than Boba Fett Disintegrator in this deck. And obviously, it is a lot more budget, so that's the reason I did it. So this is basically a modified version of 2 Moons deck, as kind of something that would. And 2 Moons, I think, has done a lot of research on this Cad Bane red. So having a budget version of it, I think, makes a lot of sense, and it makes I think this deck is pretty powerful. It's not good against everything. That's that's the main inconvenience of pretty much any leader that has sort of an ability like this that basically can only affect enemy units, is that this is going to be very good against aggro, it's going to be quite decent against mid-range, but it's going to suffer against control because then suddenly Cad Bane's ability is not that useful anymore. So the deck will typically struggle against medium control, like RAM control, the Kira, the stuff, and it will struggle against hard control, but it's pretty good against everything else, and it's really good against Sabine, notably. So I think this is a pretty decent budget deck, and it is very budget, as you can see. I think the most expensive card of the deck might be the DR44 Blasters, the Bazine. Those are like €3 rares, so it's a very cheap deck. Basically, if you're putting a budget deck together, most of the time, all the commons, you can get them for free simply by, if you have a friend that has bought some booster boxes, they will be more than happy to give you the commons because those are extremely easy to come by. And then the rares are just very cheap to acquire, and so you can put this, if you're smart about it, you can put this deck together for less than $20. I would say, yeah. So there are two decks that basically are pretty much budget just by themselves, and I didn't have to make any significant modifications to make them more budget. So now let's talk about the deck that are basically very popular, very powerful decks in which that I try to make budget, and I'll try to let you explain what are the choices that I've made in order to make the deck more affordable without affecting the power of the deck very little. And then the first one is a budget Sabine ECL. And this is basically a regular Sabine, but that doesn't play Podamron. That's just the main story here, is that I don't play Podamron in this deck. And this has been inspired to me by someone who did top 8 in the Manchester tournament, which was a 170 player tournament, so one of the biggest tournament we had in Shadow of the Galaxy. And this guy did top 8 with a deck similar to this, a deck that didn't have Podamron. I forgot his name. My list is not an exact replica of this. It is basically my own list in which that I... and basically my thought process about this is to say Podamron is amazing if you can ECL it. If you can use ECL to ambush it into play, then Podamron is amazing. Once you don't have access to ECL anymore, Podamron becomes very slow for an aggressive deck. Because you're paying 5 resources for something that has no immediate impact on the game. That's already not great for a deck in general, but for a deck that is meant to be an aggro deck, it is even worse. And the problem is that you only have one trigger of ECL, and in a lot of cases, whenever you're playing aggro, you are often forced to play ECL earlier in the game than just using it on a Podamron or a Wrecker. So one of the most common use of ECL that you're going to find is basically in the mirror of aggro. If your opponent opens up an A-Wing or a Sabine, and you have access to yourself a Sabine or an A-Wing, you can ECL the opponent unit. And your opponent is first player. If you play the Sabine normally, so Sabine versus Sabine, your opponent is going to play first. It's going to attack with your Sabine against your Sabine, and you're going to lose your Sabine, and his opponent is going to keep his Sabine. And that's a horrible, horrible start. I would say it's almost like game-losing start. And the same is true if you open up A-Wing versus A-Wing. So ECL allows you to fix that problem because you can ECL the opponent, and you basically completely flip the perspective. You get to have your A-Wing surviving and his opponent A-Wing dying instead of the other way around. Obviously, in this case, it means you have to use your ECL, so your opponent will have an opportunity to come back into the game because he has access to ECL and you don't, but it is a much, much better start, and will often make the difference between winning and losing. So there's that. And there's also the play of just ECL K2SO is also a play that you're going to see very often. K2SO is a very good ECL target, as you can come into play, deal with something, deal some overwhelm damage, and stay alive. That just is very, very strong play. So, and then after this, of course, you still got a Wrecker as a top curve ECL target, which is very powerful. So this deck basically says, having Podamron gives you more consistency because it gives you more chances to be able to make that big mid-range play. But sometimes having Podamron can be a little bit awkward in a sense that you can draw. And the fact that that person managed to do top 8 of the Manchester tournament without Poe proves that it is indeed possible to play a Sabine deck without Poe. So one of the problems that people do in order to go around that problem of saying that, well, if your Poe is going to be useless in late stage of the game, I'm simply going to be playing Timely Intervention in order to contravene that. And Timely Intervention has its own problem. It does disturb for a cause I believe in. It does disturb for a cause I believe in. It does, and it's a pretty slow card, so it's not going to be useful in every matchup. It's only going to be useful in very slow matchups. Another characteristic of this deck is like I don't run any Dark Sabers. Obviously, Dark Saber is legendary, very expensive card, so also got rid of this. Dark Saber, in my opinion, is not mandatory in a Sabine deck because it simply is. I think if your opponent knows that you're not playing Dark Saber, then it might have a negative impact on your deck. But if your opponent doesn't know that you're not playing Dark Sabers and has to play around Dark Sabers anyway, I think the advantage of actually having Dark Saber in your deck is minimum. Dark Saber is very powerful if played in the right situation, but there's going to be a lot of situations where it's very awkward and simply resource it. So in my opinion, playing 3 copies of Dark Saber is very dangerous in a Sabine deck, as the card is going to be quite clunky. I usually advise to play 2 Dark Sabers or even 1 Dark Sabers, and also don't forget that Dark Saber disturb your 4 cards I believe in. So I'll say, well, if it's only going to be 1 or 2 slots, in my version of Sabine ECL, I've always only used 1 Dark Sabers personally, then it's really not that big of a deal to get rid of it. In my opinion, by not playing Dark Saber, you are making your deck worse, but it's really such a small downgrade that I think it is worth doing if you're going for a budget deck. So what is the advantage of this version over a regular Sabine deck? Well, it has 100% hit chance on 4 cards I believe in, which is very nice. So in the main deck you are 100% chance to get all 4 damage from the 4 cards I believe in. You playing a lot of Rebel, so you have a lot of Rebel synergy, so you get a Rebel Assault and the Mail Ceremony coming in. Everything is pretty much, there's a high density of Rebel. It is a very Rebel focused build. I think the only non-Rebel is going to be Wrecker, which is and the Kitsu Onyo. Everything else is a Rebel, so makes Jean Dodonna very strong for the mirror match. Yeah, and so my sideboard is basically the same as my regular version of Sabine, so play the U-Wing Reinforcement. If you want to make even more budget, you can definitely find something else to play than U-Wing Reinforcement, but I think U-Wing is reasonable in terms of price. So yeah, this deck is definitely on the pricier side of the budget options, but because you have you are basically playing 9 rares that are fairly expensive, like 3 copies of Kitsu Onyo, 3 Focus, I believe 3 Wreckers, but you're still gonna be under, if you are smart about it, and you still can go under the $50 mark by putting together this deck, and it's going to be very powerful. Moving on, we got my budget Boba Green. Basically Boba Green in set 1 was one of the most expensive deck in the game for 2 reasons, because he was playing the 2 most expensive card of the game, which is Boba Fett Disintegrator and Darth Vader. In Shadow of the Galaxy, things are very different because it is now relatively widely admitted that Darth Maul, in the context of a tempo version of Boba Green, Maul is a better card than Vader, because it has this 7 attack overwhelm, which allows you to deal a lot of damage to the opponent base and be a potential finisher. And so that's a very big. So obviously there's a lot of decks that play both. But if you're going for a more tempo aggressive version, which is this version is, so there's basically 2 kind of versions of Boba which are kind of roaming around. The first one is the more mid-range value version that usually plays 30 HP base, and then there's the more tempo old school version that runs Energy Conversion Lab. And I believe I believe that there's a way to build the tempo version with ECL that can be extremely budget, and that's the case of this specific version here. So we're replacing Vader by Maul, which obviously makes the deck tremendously cheaper. I think Maul is about $6 if I'm not mistaken, so it's fairly cheap. And then we are replacing, of course, Boba Disintegrator by Toro Calican. And I believe, especially in ECL, I believe Boba Disintegrator is better than Toro in an ECL version, because ECL Boba is still very strong, and then you can use Boba Fett's armors on Boba himself. But the downgrade is very, very small, because obviously Toro has other advantages. You can equip it with Ultra DR44 blasters, and then you can start going to town with some bounty hunters. We're playing the full package of 4 LOM, Zuckuss, Greedo, so we can untap it, attack with Toro multiple times and do some pretty crazy stuff. So I think Toro is pretty strong. A lot of decks basically play both. For this version, we decided to go for 3 Toro Calican, and that's basically what we run. So this is, as I said, it's basically, I would say, this deck is extremely close in power level as a regular Boba Green deck, and it is, in my opinion, really affordable. Once again, it is definitely on the pricier side compared to the previous budget deck we've talked about, but still under the $50 mark. I think the most expensive card of this deck is going to be Maul at $6, and then you're gonna have like Fire Spray at 3. Both its armor are 2.5, 44 blasters at 2.5, and that's gonna be a pretty affordable. Yeah, so this is kind of like, this is kind of that budget Boba Green, and I think it's a very powerful deck for something that costs less than $50. So yeah, so this is something I wanted to show to you guys. If you are discouraged in taking part in events in Star Wars Unlimited because you don't have the budget to buy the most expensive decks, there are a wide amount of different options that you can run that can be extremely effective in tournaments, and you can 100% you can take a showdown with those kind of decks. I think that, as I said earlier, some of those decks have been featured in top 8 in some of the biggest tournament we had in Shadow of the Galaxy. So there's no reason why if you play the deck properly, obviously, there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to make a performance in tournament with those decks. So those are like pretty powerful decks, and they are very affordable. This is one of the main advantages of Shadow of the Galaxy, is that it provided us with a lot of cards that are very competitive and not legendaries. Most of the legendaries in Shadow of the Galaxies are not very good, and this has allowed us to build decks that are very powerful for very budget-friendly things. And we had a lot of, and also this expansion had a lot of replacements for some of the most expensive cards of the set and replaced them by cheaper ones. So that's it for me. Let me know if there's another budget deck that you think is very powerful, and share it on the comments below. This could be additional information for people who are looking for a budget deck. And if you like that kind of content, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.